Awaken your shadow. The truth sets some people free. It offends everyone else. By Seth, the Red Neo, Cherupak.
Chapter 9, Part 2. The Shadow of the Hypocritical Self.
The hypocritical self is the shadow of your charismatic self. It is charisma without coherence, presence divorced from integrity, and communication severed from the heart that animates it. This shadow self takes the stage when we seek validation, our natural human need to be seen, heard, and understood, through addiction to approval, status, and power. We do this for fear of becoming invisible in a competitive and socially driven world. Our need for validation is normal, but when it's pushed into shadow, it becomes a tangled mess of impulses and desires that drive us to put on masks instead of showing up as our true and authentic selves. The hypocritical self is the mask we put on to guard our frail ego from the ruthless rejection and invalidation of the external world. These masks blind us to the truth about ourselves and others. We stop noticing the quiet cues in another person's eyes. We mistake performance for connection, and manipulation replaces persuasion. These techniques block our ability to listen with empathy, and they corrupt our hearts so that self-consciousness replaces self-awareness. They alienate us from the honesty that keeps us human, and they disconnect us from others. This makes us vulnerable to self-deception and hypocrisy. This inner sickness finds outer reinforcement in our cultural misunderstanding of the word hypocrite. Our modern interpretation of this word is far removed from its meaning in the stories that made it popular. These stories are written in the New Testament Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Modern culture defines a hypocrite as someone who says one thing and does another, but the original word, as written in the Gospels, comes from the Greek word hypokrites, meaning stage actor. By this meaning, a hypocrite is someone who puts on a mask and a performance in hopes of winning approval and status. Both psychology and scripture describe the same human tendency in different language: to perform rather than reveal, to present virtue instead of admitting vulnerability, and to use light to hide our shadows instead of exposing them. This is the maladjusted mask of the hypocritical self. Jung called this mask the persona, an adaptive set of personality traits that many of us use to function in society. The mask itself is not the problem. The problem is when you come to believe that the mask is necessary for meeting your natural need for validation. You wear it so long you come to depend on it. Over time, you forget that you're wearing one at all. The persona steps in to occupy the throne of the charismatic self. Speech becomes theater, where we imitate empathy in a conversation instead of truly listening. People are reduced to members of an audience. Others stop being participants in genuine dialogue and instead become spectators to a performance. In conversations, this might look like speaking to impress rather than connect, gauging reactions instead of seeking understanding, or delivering emotional monologues that invite applause rather than response. Over time, these interactions lose reciprocity. Relationships flatten into transactions where attention becomes the currency and authenticity the casualty. The pull of attention turns addictive. The third entity, the relationship itself, the living field between two people, is reduced to a stage. Picture a couple having dinner where both are subtly performing, choosing words, gestures, and tones to maintain image instead of connection, or a manager who listens only to appear empathetic while secretly rehearsing their next response, or catching your own reflection in the Zoom window and adjusting your face mid-sentence. These are examples of relationships turned into performances, where authenticity yields to audience management and the sacred space between people becomes a stage for ego instead of a temple for truth, talking about repair without attempting it. The hypocritical self feeds on the same need that drives the charismatic self, the human need to be seen, heard, valued, and received. When the charismatic self is online and actualized into its higher self, demonstrated through consistent authenticity, congruence between word and action, and a felt sense of alignment when communicating, steady breath, clear eye contact, actions that match. This need promotes presence. In shadow, it mutates into an insatiable hunger for validation. In our modern world, this looks like refreshing social media notifications every few minutes, boasting of things we intend to do but never following up, launching a day 1/100 thread and quitting by day 6, changing your LinkedIn headline to founder after buying a domain, endlessly redesigning logos and images, rewriting bios and mission statements, and many times not even publishing a first draft, starting a newsletter or podcast with an intro post and no follow-ups, and counting hearts and pre-likes as traction. It's eating applause like junk food and mistaking it for nourishment. All these are demonstrations that gluttony isn't just about overconsumption of food. It is an appetite that consumes our attention, time, and energy in pursuit of validation. It consumes praise without ever converting it into presence, calm attention, honest follow-through. Our relationships pay for this unsatisfied debt with feigned trust and missed opportunities to repair. We often think that hypocrisy is only a sickness of religious people, but even this singling out of this demographic diverts attention from the daily indulgences of people who claim to hate religious hypocrisy. Jesus called out this pattern of approval seeking in Matthew 6:1-7 from his infamous Sermon on the Mount. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words.
Here Jesus speaks of people who curate the surface, but exile their interiors. External decoration masking internal disorder, like a public apology video with perfect lighting that avoids any private repair or restitution. His words reach beyond moral critique, and they are not just reserved for religious people. They unveil a spiritual pathology. Jesus was not simply condemning public vanity. He was diagnosing what happens when the soul's inner decay is embalmed beneath a performance of purity. The cup and dish gleam because the actor has learned to scrub the visible while leaving the invisible to rot. The tombs are whitewashed because death demands decoration when life has fled.
Later, Jesus names it outright. Beneath the choreography of virtue lie dead men's bones, the remnants of unacknowledged shadow, resentment, envy, deceit, lust, and pride sealed behind the mask. Like any corpse, these repressed parts ferment, The odor draws the flies of Beelzebub, the lord of decay, who feeds on denial the way a ghoul feeds on flesh, seen in ordinary life as resentment leaking out as sarcasm, secret binges, or contempt that corrodes a home. What was meant to protect the soul becomes a banquet for its undoing, as the unprocessed shadow, ignored, silenced, unspoken, turns toxic and attracts its own tormentors. Thus, the external theater that seeks applause becomes a mausoleum for the living, and the hypocrisy that guards against shame invites corruption to feast within. We become the performer Jesus criticized when he said, "You cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. You are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness." Matthew 23:25-28. Dead men's bones isn't an empty insult. It's a diagnosis of what happens when unprocessed shadow gets sealed behind a persona. Repression that ferments in the darkness of our subconscious leaks out through our conscious words and behaviors. You see it in the polished team lead who quotes values at all hands but gossips in DMs, or the model couple with glossy posts and private contempt. In both cases, words stop telling the truth and start hiding it. This is the price paid by those who repress their need for validation, where it grows in the shadows into something twisted and monstrous. This magnifies their shadow traits, further feeding the grief, shame, guilt, or bitterness that made them repress those traits in the first place. This spiritual sickness expresses itself through more hypocritical and self-sabotaging behaviors that, because of their repression, become impossible to see or understand. This is the self-condemnation and rejection that attracts Beelzebub, the spiritual predator of this shadow self, and the demon of the sin of gluttony. John's Gospel gives the deeper diagnosis of this disease and the only honest way to escape its clutches, and this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For every one that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they are wrought in God. John 3:19-21, KJV. Notice the phrasing, he that doeth truth. Truth is not just uttered, it is lived. The one who does truth comes to the light so that what is real can be seen. Hypocrisy, by contrast, tidies the room before the guests arrive, arranging everything to look perfect while shoving the mess into the closet. It spotlights the performance like a lighting trick on the set of a movie, while making the shadow traits, the hidden motives of the performer, fade into the background. Decoration and deception replace illumination. The goal isn't honesty, but control over what others see, editing what stays in shadow, like adjusting the brightness on a stage so only the flattering angles remain visible. It's the art of managing perception rather than revealing truth. The spotlight of attention replaces the mirror of self-reflection. The charismatic self chooses performance over repair. Modern psychology names the same pattern in secular terms. Jung warned that when we over-identify with the persona, the public mask, we exile the shadow, and whatever we banish returns as compulsion. Irving Goffman showed that everyday life runs on front stage/backstage roles that help us coordinate reality until we start living for the audience and the role becomes a cage. Torrey Higgins' self-discrepancy theory explains why that cage hurts. When the gap between the actual self and the ought/ideal self widens, anxiety, shame, and depressive spirals follow. That widening increases the effort required to maintain the mask. You can feel the cost. Extra cognitive load to keep stories straight, gaze control, timing your laughs, checking how you're landing instead of what's true. All of this points to a single pattern. The performance grows while the person shrinks. Words stack higher, the self stands thinner. When speech tries to do the work of integrity, strain shows up in the body, in the room, and in the relationship. The ancient remedy is simple and hard at once. Speak less, live more. Or, as a wiser voice said long before us, impact without integrity collapses. Or, as the Dhammapada puts it, better than 1,000 useless words is one word that brings peace. Dhammapada Ver 100, from the book The Thousands. One life aligned is worth more than 1,000 polished statements. The charismatic self knows this. It lets silence do work. The hypocritical self does not trust silence. It fills the air because quiet exposes the gap between performance and presence. This is also where the mishandling of the principle of polarity shows itself. When compassion and truth are reconciled, presence precedes words, and words carry life. When they are split, the pendulum swing begins. Some learn to soften so thoroughly that truth never lands. Appeasement wears the costume of kindness while enabling harm. Others sharpen until love cannot reach them. Precision becomes a blade for dominance, certainty a shield against being touched. Both moves are familiar to any culture saturated in performance. The contract of language is quietly broken in this shadow, not by overt lies, but by consecrating image management. Right speech thins into marketing. Promises without payment. Flattery as currency. Strategic ambiguity to preserve options. Empathic listening collapses into audience reading, not to understand, but to steer in the direction the wind is blowing. James calls the tongue a fire. In hypocrisy, that fire lights the stage while the heart remains dark. Over time, our external theater begins to rewrite our inner architecture. Maintain a mask long enough and you will no longer remember the face beneath it. Like the celebrity who begins to believe their own press releases, or the reformer who becomes the very tyrant they once opposed. History is full of figures, religious leaders, politicians, even artists, who started in sincerity but fused with their image until the performance consumed the real person. This line is the slow death of self-recognition, the moment when reputation replaces reality. Cognitive load studies on deception and heavy impression management show measurable strain. Brittle timing, gaze control costs, micro pauses at truth boundaries. Over time, the ought self ossifies into an idol. We start serving the audience we imagine rather than the God who sees. And the longer the tomb is whitewashed, the more bones accumulate inside. Uncleanness multiplies, and with it the flies. Spiritual predators, systems, people, ideologies feed on that rot because it is predictable. A person starving for validation will trade agency for applause every time. Hypocrisy hollows out relationships. The third entity is meant to be a sanctuary where two bring their truth to be shaped into something living. Under the hypocritical self, the temple is repurposed into a stage. Connection becomes choreography, seduction here, suspicion there, confessional oversharing today, intricate defensiveness tomorrow. The relationship oscillates between dominance and withdrawal, talking and vanishing, dazzling disclosure and calculated secrecy. If you've ever felt this whiplash, you know its signature line, I was seen, then I was used, or its twin, I was cherished, then I was tried in the court of their interpretations. Scripture does more than condemn this. It describes its mechanics. They say and do not do. The tongue outruns the heart. All their works they do to be seen. The audience becomes the God. You have neglected the weightier matters, justice and mercy and faith. The light things are lifted, the heavy things are left. Whitewashed tombs, dead men's bones, repression framed as righteousness, and then the Johannine antidote, do truth, come to light. Let deeds be seen that they are wrought in God. The difference is not flawless performance. It is willingness to be exposed. You can feel the difference in the body. Presence relaxes the jaw, drops the breath, slows the cadence, sacrifices cleverness for contact. Performance tightens, speeds, scans. Presence can say, "I was wrong," and the room relaxes and opens, even if the admission costs dearly. Performance says, "Mistakes were made," and the room grows brittle, even if the phrasing is perfect. The first brings light to deeds, the second adjusts lighting on the stage. You will also see this difference in your private reflections after public moments. If you are possessed by performance, you will need the refresh, views, comments, replies. You will feel the crash if the numbers lag. You will rummage for a hotter take, a sharper line, a safer angle. If presence is governing, you will feel spent but clean. The line from the Dhammapada will ring true. One word that brought peace was enough. The hypocritical self violates the contract of language, not only through lies, but through consecrated vagueness. It mishandles polarity by splitting compassion from truth. It turns the third entity into an audience. Its fuel is an untended need for validation. Its symptom is an addiction to impression. Its cost is subtle at first, dissonance then depletion, but the bill always comes due. There is only one way out of this darkness. As Jesus said, "He that doeth truth cometh to the light." There is no fine print on that line. It's a command without conditions, a doorway without a lock. To do truth means to act in alignment with what is real, not to negotiate with it. There are no hidden clauses promising comfort or applause, only the promise of exposure and, through that exposure, liberation. The light does not flatter, it reveals. And yet this is the only way out of the mausoleum of performance, to step fully into visibility, where even our unhealed parts can breathe again. This is where the path turns. The soul that risks the light begins to see how the stage, once lit for display, can become a place of revelation. What once served as performance now becomes practice. The light that exposes also warms. It burns away pretense, but leaves presence intact. And that presence, once reclaimed, is what allows the next realization. That every attempt to curate safety or control, whether through charm or intellect, is just another costume in waiting. On some stages, safety is curated through constraints that smother truth. On others, control is curated through brilliance so sharp it cannot be held. Both are familiar in our time. Both are costumes waiting in the wings. For now it is enough to see how the mask convinced you it was your face, how the spotlight replaced the sun, and how words were asked to carry what only a life can pay for. When the mask is a garment again and not a throne, the heart can govern the tongue, and the stage can darken so that the sanctuary can fill with light. Hypocrisy and the dark feminine. The dark feminine expression of the hypocritical self does not begin as deception. It begins as something almost invisible, a reflex toward harmony that feels like kindness, a yes offered to soften a frown, a laugh that smooths a jagged silence, a quick reading of the room that keeps tempers from rising. She learns early that the surest way to move safely through a world of sharp edges is to round them off for everyone else. Approval becomes both her crown and her shelter. Attunement becomes a skill so polished it looks like love. This at first is mercy. The body discovers that compliance cools heat faster than truth can, so it leans toward warmth, a practiced softness, a smile that arrives a half second before it's needed, words that wrap around discomfort until it stops struggling. The feminine current, receptive by nature, tilts into hyper-receptivity. She can hear micro-inflections others miss, feels the wind shift in a conversation before anyone else notices. It feels like service, it feels like grace. And for a long time it works. But what quiets her storms also quiets her true self. Her instinct to soothe, repeated often enough, becomes a choreography. What began as care becomes craft. She learns to place each gesture just so, the nod of understanding, the disarming joke, the gentle paraphrase that lets someone save face. The room relaxes, the praise comes, safety arrives dressed as admiration. Then the light. When attention is learned as safety, the body starts to seek it. She steps toward the brightness because the brightness keeps the shadows from gathering. The spotlight becomes a hiding place. If everyone is looking, no one is seeing. The glare dazzles, and in the dazzle, mirrors go dim. Performance feels like intimacy. Applause sounds like belonging. It is a clever bargain. The noise is so high that the ache goes quiet. Fawning slides almost imperceptibly into peacocking. The instinct to soothe becomes an instinct to shine. A reel here, a polished update there, a story told with exquisite timing and careful revelation. The persona is tender and deft, vulnerable but curated, the perfect balance of candor and control. As Taylor Swift puts it in Anti-Hero 2022, I'll stare directly at the sun but never in the mirror. This line isn't an indictment, it's a mirror of how many of us survive. A superstar may perfect an ideal mask. The rest of us experiment with lesser masks. In both cases, mastery of the mask replaces meeting the true self. Attention is persuasive. It promises to be the shortcut to intimacy. Yet after the lights drop, a different sensation arrives, the thinness that follows borrowed oxygen. Breath climbs, shoulders recall the weight they were asked to carry. The scroll begins. Did they like it? Did it land? Am I still held? The body begins to crave responses like sugar, sweetness, then crash. So we sweeten again. In private, there's a tiny tremor, too small to call guilt, too honest to dismiss. It whispers that some of the warmth served the image more than the truth. But the whisper is easy to hush. It sounds impolite to hear. Better to keep the choreography moving. Better to protect everyone's comfort than to risk the quiet that might summon a mirror. Over time, the nervous system learns the loop. Visibility to relief, to depletion, to chase. What once looked like generosity starts to taste like consumption. She offers more presence than she actually has. She says yes to keep the field smooth. She narrates empathy while avoiding her own edges. The outer offering remains luminous. The inner ledger shows overdraft. The ache that begins to spread has no obvious name, only a direction away from herself. Only later does language catch up. The first word that fits is not hypocrisy. It is something softer and closer, self-apology.
She utters, "I'm sorry," even if no one asks for it.
A habit of shrinking the story, of erasing the difficult angle, of becoming smaller so the room can stay big. It feels noble. It reads as compassion.
And yet each revision subtracts a detail the soul needed to remain whole. Self-apology, practiced long enough, hardens into a posture. It is an act of self-repentance without evidence of a crime. Here, her mask begins to fuse with her soul. She plays the role of the agreeable one, the peacemaker, the endlessly warm presence, until it ceases to be a role and threatens to become a self. This is the first quiet betrayal, not of others, but of the inner witness who knows when the warmth is real and when it is woven. The outer coherence continues. The inner coherence thins.
The culture will not call this a crisis. It will call it mastery. Algorithms reward the glow. Institutions promote the person who never introduces friction. Communities lift the one who can speak for everyone while saying little that cuts. There are entire economies built on this kind of charisma, soft-edged, ever-available, atmospherically kind. And so the loop tightens, applause as proof of existence as permission to keep erasing. Only after this long apprenticeship to harmony does the older word return with its edge. Hypocrites, stage actor. Not because she is lying to others, but because the role has started to perform her. The outer compassion becomes camouflage for inner withdrawal. The polished cup gleams inside, the water level drops. The arrangement is subtle. I will keep you comfortable if you will keep me loved. But love earned by erasure is not love. It is audience. What makes this a dark feminine pattern is not gender, but energy. The receptive pole, built for attunement, gets conscripted into servitude. Listening becomes leverage for social safety. Softness becomes strategy. Even the most sincere gifts, empathy, grace, exquisite sensitivity, get siphoned into the mask until the source runs dry. It shows up in small domestic theaters, the partner who never raises a rupture, who communicates in perfectly tempered phrases until one day she ghosts the life she helped maintain. In workrooms, the leader who can echo every viewpoint with velvet accuracy while never risking the one sentence that would actually change a course. In communities of faith or practice, the woman who seems to carry the group's heart and privately carries a fatigue that no rest day touches. Bodies tell the truth that voices avoid. Watch the jaw that sets before the smile. Notice the breath that rises toward the throat when the meeting begins. Feel the tremor in the hands after a carefully crafted confession that revealed enough to earn trust, but not enough to require change. After the applauded vulnerability comes the crash. After the crash, the search for the next small stage. The spiritual grammar for this is older than our screens. There is a hunger beneath the hunger. Gluttony not for food, but for feedback, an appetite to be kept present in other people's minds so that we need not face our own. They do their works to be seen by others, as Jesus said, not as scorn, but as a diagnosis. The seeing substitutes for the being. The audience replaces the encounter. The heart gets polished in ways that make it harder for light to enter. If there is anger here, it is an orphaned anger. Rage at the cost of the bargain no one else seems to see. She gives, and when the return is only more request, resentment grows roots. She does not yet name it betrayal. She calls it exhaustion. She calls it burnout. She calls it unfair. But somewhere beneath the names is the older truth. The first betrayal was inward, and it was quiet. By the time hypocrisy becomes visible, it is less an act than an architecture. Words that sound like empathy are deployed to manage perception. Bids for intimacy are shaped to be unassailable. The persona has integrated fragments of darkness, resentment rebranded as boundaries, control varnished as care, until the mask is not an accessory but an organ. The performance does not feel false. It feels necessary in the same way an addiction feels like a need. And still, the ache remains. This is where the dark feminine stands at the lip of a truth with no applause in it. Her deepest longing is not to be adored for the role, but to be recognized beyond it. She wants a gaze that does not confuse the choreography for the dancer. She wants to be loved where the spotlight does not reach. Most days she cannot admit this. But at night, when the body is too tired to curate, the longing breaks surface. Poetry has known this longer than our psychologies. W.B. Yeats imagined an old age in which the masks have fallen, and a woman hears a different kind of love addressed to her, not the love for brightness or smoothness, but the love that includes the weathering. He wrote, "How many loved your moments of glad grace, and loved your beauty with love false or true, but one man loved the pilgrim soul in you, and loved the sorrows of your changing face." That is the ache condensed into 4 lines, to be held not for the shine, but for the pilgrim soul, the one who travels, weathers, sorrows, and continues. The dark feminine knows, even when she cannot say it, that the applause loves the moments of glad grace, but something older in her wants to be loved in the sorrows of the changing face, where no audience gathers. This is not a moral indictment. It is a map of how a survival grace becomes a stage, and how a stage, left unchecked, becomes a sanctuary from mirrors. It is a slow movement from harmony to choreography to spotlight to self-apology to fusion of role and self to architecture of hypocrisy. And finally, the most private consequence, self-betrayal. Not a dramatic treachery, but a steady abandoning of the witness within who knows the difference between real warmth and its imitations. It does not announce itself as betrayal. It appears as an ache to be loved for what cannot be performed, to be chosen where no one is watching, to be met in the room after the last guest leaves, when the makeup is off and the practice voice has gone quiet, and the only thing left is the face that has been changing all along. That ache, too, can be hidden, another secret folded under the smile. And so the loop can run for years, even decades, because the world keeps paying for the mask. But the cost is tallied elsewhere, in a body that tightens at the thought of stillness, in a soul that grows suspicious of silence, in a life that fills with admiration and rarely knows recognition. The spotlight burns bright, while the mirror waits in the dark to condemn her again and again until she has surrendered completely to her mask.
New subheader: Hypocrisy and the Dark Masculine.
The dark masculine expression of the hypocritical self does not begin as deception either. It begins as a vow felt in a man's bones. At first it looks and feels nothing like hypocrisy or even imitation. It starts when he looks out over the chaos of his world and promises, without moving his lips, to change it or to carry it. He says, "I'll be the wall when the wind rises, I'll hold the line," or "I'll be the white knight in shining armor." His vow sounds beautiful. It forges courage and puts steel in his spine. But the same heat that molds iron can solder a mask to the skin. This is how the thing that began as his moral duty hardens into a role he has to play. At first, he is loyal to his vow. He makes the sacrifices, works late, reaches for clarity in conflict, and for control in the midst of chaos. People relax in response to his reliable yes and his solid no. Presence becomes a climate he can set. But the weather of this climate can also be staged. Somewhere between responsibility and theater, his vow slides, so slowly he cannot feel it, toward a different pledge, a vow that says, "I will be the one who cannot be questioned." This slide rarely shows up in spectacle. It manifests instead as excellence, as steadiness, as the gravity that makes rooms orbit. It draws attention. And attention is a strong drink, especially when distilled into the masculine flavor of respect. He tells himself he does not need to be liked, just respected. This respect, measured by deference to his role rather than his character, becomes his fuel and his proof. The more he depends on this external proof, the more he has to trust it. The more he trusts it, the more it becomes his armor, and the less he likes, loves, and trusts his unarmored self. Over time, a quiet battle begins inside him, the battle between his true and hidden self and the external character he has embodied. Desperate to restore his internal sense of control, he turns to the external conquest of others, not by force but by seduction. This conquest isn't reserved for bedrooms. It also happens in boardrooms. He inspires loyalty with devotion. He wins compliance through the sensation of belonging. He conquers with his attentive eyes, his attuned voice, and the warmth of making people feel chosen. He directs the spotlight away from himself and toward others. People step toward this glow and do not notice that the light is directional and selective. It reveals only what he wants to see, leaving the rest in the shadows. He calls this leadership. The room calls it charisma. But the intuition of one awakened soul recognizes it as seduction and conquest, Stories warned us of this archetype long before he was codified by modern psychology. Consider Mozart's rake, Don Giovanni, a virtuoso of allure who keeps a ledger of his sexual conquests. He turns the covenant of intimacy into a catalog of trophies. He does not seek love or loyalty. He seeks gluttonous accumulation. His seduction is aesthetic, moral, and even metaphysical. He offers women the sensation of feeling alive, while he quietly feeds on their activated feminine essence. In the end of the story, the statue of the Commendatore comes to dinner and offers Giovanni repentance 3 times. When Don Giovanni refuses, the earth opens and he is raked into hell. His lesson is not about the dangers of lust. It is the story of a man who refuses to repent for flattering, fattening, and feasting upon the souls of women he claims to worship. But the dark masculine seduction extends beyond the bedroom. He may also preach to, prosecute, and promise to purify his victims while subtly stripping them for parts. The religious scribes and Pharisees of Jesus' day perfected this theater of virtue signaling. Their internal sickness manifested as an outward devotion to moral purity and superiority. They directed their spotlight on their own good deeds, highlighted the imperfections of those they sought to rule over, and leveraged this polarity to seduce a nation into quiet submission, all under the promise and pretense of bestowing moral purity and salvation. Jesus' keen intuition and fearless public sermons expose this false polarity. His gospel of salvation, through surrender to the grace of God alone, broke the illusion of salvation through moral perfection. His words broke their spell of seduction, and the same energy that fed their hunger for dominion became fuel for its subversion. The dark masculine does not start out as a glutton for attention, approval, or status. He drifts subtly from his vow to unite with God toward a self-alienating obsession to become godly. Others start with a heartfelt vow to live as an honest, loyal, honorable, or compassionate man, only to betray those same values as we shipwreck ourselves upon the non-negotiable laws of human nature or the natural world. Modern psychology describes this drift. Modern psychologists recognize this drift and its impending crash. The persona is adaptive, even necessary at times. A wise man wears it like a raincoat, knowing when to put it on and when to take it off. He understands that it's not an extension of his body. He is completely comfortable and honest about when to put it on, when to take it off, and when to discard or replace it. But his persona is easily and often mistaken for his identity. Ask any man who he is, and you'll see a glimpse of this disconnect in his list of persona, self-assigned labels, titles, roles, duties, and even his values. He'll say, I'm an accountant, or I'm a pastor, or I'm a father, or even I'm a child of God. But ask him who he is beyond these labels and watch his response. He may fall silent before retrieving yet another label. He may grasp for more abstract and eloquent words. He may become defensive or even call you weird or crazy. Other men will give you spiritually bypassing cliches about being a disciple of Christ, a star child, or a chosen one. Very, very few men know that they are a unique and finite expression of the same universal infinite living mind from which the entire universe emerges. Even men who know this may know little or nothing about their shadow self and the needs compelling it. This lack of self-awareness compels a man to mistake the features and fragments of his persona for his true self. The more these fragments occupy the throne of his charismatic self, the deeper his need for validation retreats into the shadows, but his need remains, and the behaviors he uses to nurture them often become unpredictable, misunderstood, or self-destructive, even toxic. What he refuses or fails to own begins to own him. He fortifies his persona to regain some sense of clarity and control over this. Most self-help books are cluttered with superficial accessories for this masculine persona, including identities, goals, values, beliefs, routines, or habits. When these accessories of a man's persona bump up against the natural laws of the material or spiritual world, he has one choice: re-examine them, rationalize them, or try desperately to seduce others into pouring themselves into the mold he has made for them. Whether internal or external, his failure to control the uncontrollable curdles into contempt. Contempt fuels his deep feeling of rejection and invalidation. He becomes possessed by an insatiable hunger for attention, approval, and admiration. He creates only to consume. He nurtures only to devour, and he fortifies his act against anyone mature or confident enough to see through his facade. Yet, on the surface, the dark masculine seducer appears attractive, powerful, admirable, and even enviable. His archetype has built empires, established organizations, shepherded families, mentored teams, and led movements. But his lifestyle is often constructed to separate his adorned stage from the vices of his private, scar-tissue-ridden internal life. He repositions himself as the man he dreams of becoming, but lodged in the cracks and crevasses of his unspoken thoughts and repressed longings, Beelzebub sits with crooked hands, stirring the contents of a fly-swarmed cauldron filled with dismembered parts of a man who once was. The estranged fragments of the once-admired seducer take orbit around the non-existent axis of the man he once vowed to become. The things unacceptable to his public life leak into the barren landscape of his unscripted life. He avoids conversations and friendships where he cannot steer the narrative. His kingdom, once a refuge for those who, for a time, believed in him or even loved him, stands in ruins. His mask becomes his identity, his speech becomes performance, and his silence becomes an altar to his shame. For the man who clings to his mask, hypocrisy comes, not as a revelation, but as a late diagnosis. He realizes that he's devoted the most productive years of his life to the belief that he was delivering others from their own demons. But somewhere amongst the peaks and valleys of his journey, his burden shifted from shouldering their chaos to manufacturing and protecting his own image. The difference between righteous anger and resentment blurs. His youthful conviction collapses into contrition, contribution into compulsion, and compulsion into consumption. His relationships end without funerals. Colleagues who once smiled upon him begin to withdraw. His children become audiences because it is the safest way for them to be near him. His self-betrayal leaves him nursing an existential grief, a deep emptiness of a man who never got his chance to step into daylight, to speak in his own voice, to love and to be loved for who he always was, and not the actor on the stage. He begins to hunger, not for conquest, but for recognition, to be loved for the man beneath the roles. Then comes the bargaining, the rationalizations, and the bittersweet reminders. He tells himself he only wanted respect. He realizes that he has achieved it. He tells himself he was denied a single victory. He is reminded by others that he has had many. He tells himself that he wants to walk through darkness and emerge a better man. He realizes that he already has again and again. Still, in the quiet hours when the crowds have left, the question haunts him: how much of myself did I trade for all of this?
The poet Dylan Thomas lamented in defiance over this tragic crossroad in his poem, "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night," saying,
"Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright. Their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Here the poet calls for the false light to rise in battle one last time. He hands this belief to other desperate men like a creed. But this struggle is no longer a directive to perform another act of conquest. It is a lament of the tenderness of loss. It is not, finally, about raging against the dying of light. It is refusing to repent to the quieter death of self-truth, accepting the parts that feel not right in the mask and no longer baptizing them as virtue. He sits alone backstage, his audience departed, composing a requiem disguised as the final act of the play that has become his life. His raw defiance is captured beautifully in the lyrics of a song that was once my personal anthem. When the crowds are gone and I'm all alone, playing the final song, now that the lights are gone, turn them on again. One more time for me, my friend. Turn them on again. I never wanted to know, never wanted to see. I wasted my time till time wasted me. I never wanted to go, always wanted to stay, 'cause the person I am are the parts that I play. So I plot and I plan, I hope and I scheme, to the lure of a night filled with unfinished dreams. I'm holding on tight to a world gone astray, as they charge me for years I can no longer pay. This song echoes the longing of a man who wrote a script for a part he could not play. In his heart he feels unbearable debt accumulated through his years of performance. Still he clings to the fragments of his persona, no longer as a noble vow, but as a survival strategy. Only when the arena empties, when the thread gets no replies and the metrics recede, does a quieter awareness surface. The house lights come on. The set reveals itself for what always was. A chair without arms waits in a room without spotlights. Somewhere under the choreography, his boyhood first vow flickers, the one meant for blessing, not for theater. The rest is silence. In that silence his bargaining returns, no longer as battle hymn, but as a final plea for victory. And you, my father there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Here the poet begs to finally see the broken man behind the mask. Not the knight without blemish, but the imperfect man who, despite his battles with the past, discovers and demonstrates his light. That is the life he aches to be loved for. Not the gleam of the armor, but the face that learned to bear its removal. The poet mistakes the dying light for the true light, fractured by his grief, while feeling the sting of its darkness at the time. This is the final plea of the dark masculine, calling out for redemption from something that can never bestow it, and that will destroy him with its blessing to strengthen him a final time. If he finds the strength to rise, it will only be to finish his final act, and his audience has dwindled to the final few who stayed, not because they loved his mask, but because they were waiting to see if the man beneath would finally emerge. He will spend the last of his strength and find himself in dust and ashes, like the tortured Old Testament prophet Job, amidst the ruins of a kingdom set to ruin, an exile in an alien planet, where the seducing language he's trained himself to speak is understood only by him and the ghosts of those who loved, not the man, but the mask. His extraction will only come when he embraces the polarity between dark and light, when he recognizes them as one and the same and embraces both. Then his eyes will open, his heart will soften, and he will see, like a lighthouse in the distance, his only hope for awakening and activating his true self and for being loved as the man he is, not the man he sacrificed his life and his soul to become. I am still learning to walk this path. New subheader, Gluttony as the Devourer of Hope. Gluttony is the most misunderstood and misrepresented of all the 7 deadly sins. It's more subtle, sinister, and self-destructive than the caricature of the fat man from the movie Seven, who was forced at gunpoint to eat himself to death as a punishment for his overindulgence. This modern interpretation of gluttony hides something deeper and darker, something woven with crooked hands into the fabric of our modern culture and our souls. Gluttony is the superficial self-medication that drowns out the voice of truths we're too afraid or too ashamed to speak. It is consumption replacing confession and authentic communication. It is the self-cannibalization of our deepest hopes. The children's poet Shel Silverstein, who I consider a modern prophet, depicted this truth with disturbing metaphorical precision in his poem Hungry Mungry. This seemingly whimsical children's tale turns gradually darker as Hungry Mungry devours everything without satisfying his hunger. He starts with a lavish meal. Then he devours his parents. Then the whole world, leaving only emptiness. As Silverstein wrote, he ate his mother's hat, and then her shoes, and then her dress, and with her arms and legs he started on her chest. The poem ends with a darker twist where Hungry Mungry's macabre banquet ends in self-cannibalism. Then sitting there in the cold, dark air, he started to nibble his feet, then his legs, then his hips, then his neck, then his lips, till he sat there just gnashing his teeth, 'cause nothing was nothing, was nothing, was nothing, was nothing, was left to eat. Here we see what begins as a playful story evolve into a mirror of our own hunger, our impulse to consume everything in sight and still end up hollow. Modern laboratory research has tied this hollowness to clear mechanisms. Under stress, cortisol shifts the brain toward reward-dense foods, comfort eating as self-medication rather than nourishment. Epel et al., 2001, Dahlman's glucocorticoid model. Modern science confirms that suppressing our emotions doesn't neutralize them. Rather, it raises physiological load and keeps our craving loops alive. Gross and Levenson's expressive suppression studies. Sleep debt worsens the pull, lowering leptin, satiety, and raising ghrelin, hunger. So the body literally feels emptier after a short night. Spiegel et al. 2004. Put simply, the more truth we swallow, the more our nervous system misreads that swallowed heat as hunger, and the more we reach for edible, digital, or chemical calories to fill what confession would have cleared. Adam and Epel's review on stress-reward eating. In ancient folklore, Beelzebub, once a pagan lord of sacrifice, was rebranded as Lord of the Flies by those who saw the emptiness of unsanctified offerings. The pagans indulged in ceremonies of lust and instant gratification, where sacrifice was replaced with feasts of overindulgence. Those who worshipped the God of the Old Testament understood sacrifice as discipline and devotion, as the sacrifice of future value on the altar of present pleasure. They saw flies swarming around the empty rituals of the pagan nations. This is a fitting image of how gluttony turns sacred sacrifice into superficial consumption, leaving nothing but decay. In this light, gluttony is the counterfeit of sacrifice. It's a ritual of repression rather than renewal, a feast offered to the God of silence rather than the God who creates. Before the mouth devoured, it was made to bless. Before we consumed, we communed with God. The mouth was once an altar where breath turned into words that blessed, bound, confessed, and prophesied. Our mouths were made to be channels between the spiritual and material world. When its sacred functions are neglected or abandoned, appetite replaces them. The same mouth that was created to release truth begins to pull everything inward. Food, entertainment, attention, applause. When we refuse to confess, we are condemned to consume. Appetite begins to do the work that truth and presence were meant to do. We eat, scroll, sip, and perform, not out of hunger, but out of emptiness. We consume to self-medicate against the pain we feel, or the nectarine ache inside. The sweetness turned sour when truth swallowed collect and rot within us. Flies swarm, and an ancient spiritual predator comes to feast on the rejected parts of us. The ancients called this demon Beelzebub. This spiritual predator lurks where offering, spoil, and surplus is hoarded without sanctification. Beelzebub does not conquer by shock and awe or direct attacks. He seduces and subdues with fear, shame, guilt, grief, and bitterness. Then he fattens himself on the shadow identity we have buried instead of expressing. In the old polemic of 2 Kings, Baal-zebub of Ekron is mocked as a carrion god. Sometimes he is simply called Baal. Later demonologies recast him as the prince of devils, who subdued even Lucifer and became the ruler of hell, the place of eternal isolation and of rotting things. He is the spirit who gathers where offerings spoil and appetites rule. Whether named Baal-Zebul, Lord/Prince, or twisted into Zebub, flies, the folklore is consistent. Flies attend decay in the same way our fearful, paranoid, and self-condemning thoughts swarm around the self-rejected fragments of our shadow self. Beelzebub presides wherever surplus is hoarded without sanctification, and words meant for confession curdle into silence. In our time, this substitution has gone systemic. Once sacred offerings have been replaced by rituals of intake. We binge in search of belonging. We scroll instead of speaking. We snack on the symbols of intimacy while starving for its substance. Most of this intake is not for fuel, but for anesthesia, the body reaching for anything to dull the ache of our internal and external experiences of rejection. Beelzebub occupies the space between what we show and what we suppress. He fattens himself not on what we eat, but on what we will not speak. This is why the glutton is not always the corpulent diner. She may be the influencer measuring worth by reach, or the leader counting metrics instead of moments of truth. He may be the spiritual seeker addicted to new teachings, but incapable of confession. Gluttony, in this sense, is not about appetite at all. It's about avoidance. It is the exchange of communion for consumption. In each case, consumption functions as self-medication against the pain that confession would reveal and transfigure. The same energy that could create connection is rerouted into numbing repetition. Each repetition buys relief and sells off hope. In William Golding's Lord of the Flies, the boys erect a pig's head on a stake, and the flies gather. The severed head becomes a false altar, a parody of communion. The boys' chant feasts are not celebrations of life, but distractions from guilt. They kill to feel alive and eat to forget they've killed. They eat to medicate the terror of what they have become. Around them, the signal fire, built for rescue, dies out. Ralph's flame of hope is traded for the thrill of the hunt. Sacrifice would have required discipline. Consumption promises excitement. The choice is made, and the island darkens. They find themselves under Beelzebub's dominion, where the fire for the future is left to die in the name of immediate pleasure. So it is with cultures. Rome began with altars that bound people to their gods and their posterity. But when sacrifice gave way to surplus, and surplus to spectacle, the empire became a theater of appetite. Bread and circuses pacified the people, trading civic virtue for entertainment and soothing collective anxiety with theatrical excess. Hope was eaten one festival at a time. Every late-stage civilization follows this curve. Sacrifice to surplus, to spectacle, to spiritual rot. Ours is no different, only digitized. The Colosseum now fits in our palms. The social media algorithm is Beelzebub's latest altar. Flies gather on the feed. Each post, each clip, each hot take is a morsel in an infinite banquet of noise. We medicate loneliness with limitless feeds. The more content we consume, the less content we become. The poet and prophet T.S. Eliot saw this inversion before the internet even existed. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? The hierarchy has collapsed. Life once produced wisdom through experience, wisdom distilled into knowledge, knowledge ordered information. But now, information floods the senses without ever rising back up the ladder. We live in the basement of meaning, surrounded by abundance that cannot feed us. Beelzebub thrives in this inversion. The more data we ingest, the less understanding we digest. The world drowns in plenty while starving for purpose. My mother taught me that the greatest sin is waste, but our greatest waste of all is not what we neglect. It's what we mindlessly consume in our attempt to fill our own emptiness. This is how gluttony devours hope in a future we could still inhabit. It requires speech and sacrifice, words and actions aligned toward what does not yet exist. But every act of overconsumption mortgages tomorrow for comfort today. Anesthesia feels merciful for a moment, then bills the future with interest. Each binge, each false feast, each moment of swallowed truth spends tomorrow's courage to buy one more hour of anesthesia. Eat, drink, and be merry, once an ode to celebration, has become a cultural commandment. But the modern version is darker. Scroll, spend, feast, and remain empty. Hope does not die in a single act of despair. It erodes through thousands of small substitutions. A conversation avoided, a truth withheld, a meal eaten for distraction, a night spent feeding on images that can't love us back. We medicate loneliness and guilt until the medicine becomes the malady. Slowly, the human imagination, the capacity to believe in a better future, atrophies. What was meant for sacrifice becomes self-sedation. The signal fire goes out, not with a storm, but with silence. Beelzebub does not need to possess nations by force. He only needs to convince them that comfort is enough. Once the appetite becomes the god, everything else becomes a meal. In Revelation 3:14-22, a letter to the church in Laodicea, an affluent city known for banking, textiles, and a tepid aqueduct, names the condition, "You say, 'I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing,' not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked." Lukewarmness is not a temperature, it is a metabolism. It is appetite enthroned where sacrifice should stand guard. It is overconsumption baptized as normalcy. It is self-medication disguised as maturity. You can feel Laodicea in the modern body, the restless evening orbit between fridge, phone, and TV glow, the half-sleep after midnight, thumb twitching toward one more scroll, the easy prayer that avoids the one sentence that would cost you a reputation, no persecution required, just pleasant plenty. The mouth is the hinge of this possession. When the mouth refuses to bless, to bind, to confess, to commune, it does not go quiet. It changes jobs. It becomes an intake valve. New Age superstition teaches the anxious heart to swallow. Do not speak the negative, you'll manifest it. So the secret is eaten again and again, and the appetite grows. The Christian witness says the opposite. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive. One teaching trains silence, the other trains speech toward light. Swallowing pain trains appetite to act as anesthetic. Beelzebub thrives where secrets are swallowed. Flies cannot gather where deeds are brought into daylight. But we remain, not dinner guests, but prisoners in the basement of the lukewarm house. The mouth keeps eating what the heart refuses to name. This is not abstract morality, it is a body plan. Under unspoken truth, the nervous system toggles, sympathetic urgency by day, dorsal collapse by night, sugar becomes a lever, doom scrolling a switch, alcohol a mute button, inputs doubling as analgesics. Variable ratio rewards, likes, pings, breaking news, spritz the midbrain with pursuit chemicals while the rewards themselves keep shrinking. Sleep debt tilts the hormones that manage appetite. Ghrelin rises, leptin falls, and hunger howls even after the plate is clean. The gut inflames under stress and returns the favor with mood clouds and cravings. The organism learns to manage state with intake because confession never resets the loop. The result looks pious or productive from the outside. Inside, it is merely more. Gluttony wears different costumes on different bodies. In the dark feminine pattern, safety is learned as attention. She reads rooms with exquisite precision and uses that gift for self-preservation rather than nurturing connection. Praise becomes a calorie, empathy a currency, harmony a choreography. She can narrate vulnerability with luminous softness while withholding the one boundary that would become a door. After the applause comes the crash. The jaw tightens on the way home. The breath climbs toward the throat. The pantry opens, though she is not hungry. She reaches to self-medicate the ache that only a clean sentence could relieve. She is not lying to others so much as starving herself of the nourishment only confession can provide. The audience is full, the woman is empty. In the dark masculine pattern, safety is learned as control. He begins with a vow, hold the line, be the wall, and over time the vow fuses with the mask. Respect becomes a calorie, deference a snack, metrics a meal. Leadership becomes a diet of being unchallenged. At 10:30 p.m., when the house quiets, the binges arrive in a different register. Work dashboards, war news, bourbon, porn. Each is justified as earned fuel, but each is payment for the sentence he will not speak. He uses intake to medicate the pressure of the truth he refuses to say. His cadence tightens, his gaze narrows, his body runs hot by day and flat by night. He is not lying to others so much as refusing to admit what only truth can discharge. The team is fed, the man is empty. Civilizations metabolize these patterns at scale. After war discipline comes surplus, after surplus, convenience, after convenience, identity built from consumption. We renamed desire as destiny in the 20th century and hired public relations to catechize us. Credit made tomorrow edible. Suburbia made distance a product. Television drilled the first window for spectacle. Platforms blew out the wall. Bread and circuses became a national analgesic, state-sized self-medication for the ache of meaning. The signal fire, shared sacrifice toward a shared future, has been outsourced to slogans. We keep the feast and let the flame sputter. Laodicea is not a church on a map, it is a mood in the bloodstream of an age. The ladder of meaning has inverted. Information, once the servant of knowledge, now rules the house. Knowledge, divorced from wisdom, multiplies without weight. Wisdom, cut off from life, dwindles to quotes on a screen. In that inversion, appetite becomes the instrument for managing anxiety. The average hand lifts to the face hundreds of times a day. The average eye meets a backlit sacrament more often than it meets another eye. The body still wants communion, so it accepts consumption masquerading as companionship, content as painkiller, speed as sedation. Beelzebub does not need you to worship him, he needs you to keep eating. Eat, drink, and be merry has completed its mutation. Scroll, spend, and be empty. The new feast is made of speed. The tongue learns to flatter instead of bless, to bait instead of bound, to blur instead of confess, to broadcast instead of commune. The third entity, the living field where relationships should be nourished, becomes a pantry. We reach into it for reassurance, for status, for the rush that says we still exist. The rush functions like a drug, brief relief, deeper debt. And every reach leaves the shelf barer than before. This is how hope is eaten, not with a devouring jaw, but with 1,000 delicate nibbles. The literary parable and the prophetic letter converge. On the island, Ralph's flame requires boredom, vigilance, rotation of duty, a price paid now for a future not yet guaranteed. The boys choose the feast. In Asia Minor, a rich church chooses comfort and loses sight. In the present, a rich world chooses constant intake and calls it life. The through line is simple enough to offend us. Sacrifice keeps the future available. Gluttony spends it. There is a final mask gluttony wears that looks like love. Limerence, devotion to an image, feels like intimacy while feeding on attention. It is gluttony of the gaze, a diet of projection where the beloved is consumed as a symbol rather than received as a person. It flatters the charismatic self while starving discernment. The higher selves will address this trance later. Here it is enough to name its appetite. It does not commune, it collects, and so we return to the mouth, not as a moral emblem, but as a fact of anatomy. The same opening that can bless, bind, confess, and commune is the opening through which we pour substitutes. When truth is not spoken, appetite is sent in its place. Lukewarmness, is not indifference. It is unconfessed heat dispersed across 100 tiny cravings. Self-medication is the quiet engine of this feast. Beelzebub has no army to muster. He has 1,000,000 snacks. He stands where the fire should be and offers a feast that keeps us from looking at the dark. Because you are lukewarm, Jesus says to the church in Laodicea, I will spit you out. The line offends modern ears because we have trained ourselves to hear judgment only in overt violence. But lukewarmness is a violence of another kind. It is the slow murder of futures accomplished in comforts. It is the death of signal fires by distraction. It is the diminishing of imagination into appetite until a people who once built cathedrals cannot build a quiet room. This is what Beelzebub eats, permissioned futures, one small swallow at a time. Self-medication keeps his table set. Over time, we begin to mistake his appetite for our own. When we let appetite do the work of truth long enough, the feast turns inward. We stop eating to live and begin living to eat, until even the self becomes entree. Shel Silverstein saw the end of that road in a child's rhyme, which ended in the devouring of oneself and then emptiness. This emptiness is Beelzebub's punchline, a life so committed to consuming what should have been spoken that in the end only our devouring teeth remain. This cycle only ends with the awakening and transfiguration of the self we have repressed and rejected.
End of Chapter 9, Part 2 of Awaken Your Shadow by Seth Cherepak.